Hello, my dear adventurers. If you like the story, please subscribe. Welcome back to another evening of shared tales and journeys through time. Tonight, we travel far from castle walls and forest glens, far from the familiar roads of Europe to a land of endless grass and endless sky. We journey to the great steppe, that vast ocean of earth stretching from the forests of the north to the deserts of the south, from the mountains of the west to the rising sun in the east. Here, beneath skies so wide they seem to swallow the world, a child was born who would grow to shake the very foundations of civilization. His name would become a whisper of terror in distant lands, a prayer of strength among his people, and a legend that echoes through the centuries even to our modern day. So grab your warmest cloak, settle in close to the fire, and let us begin the tale of Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the scourge of God, the man who built the largest land empire this world has ever known. The year was around 1162, though the nomads of the steppe did not count years the way settled folk did. They marked time by seasons, by the birth of foals, by the migration of herds, and the blooming of the sparse flowers that dotted the grasslands in spring. It was in such a spring, when the world was turning green again after the harsh winter, that a child came into the world in a camp along the Onon River in what we now call Mongolia. His father was Yasuge, a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, part of the great Mongol people who roamed these lands. Yasuge was not the greatest of chiefs, but he was respected. He was a warrior, as all men of the steppe had to be, skilled with bow and blade, fierce in battle, and cunning in the endless feuds and alliances that shaped life among the tribes. The steppe was not a place for the weak. It was a land that demanded strength, where only the hardy survived the winters that could freeze a man solid in his sleep, where the slightest mistake could mean death from hunger, cold, or enemy arrows. The child's mother was Holon, a woman of the Orphaned tribe. Her story was itself a tale of the brutal ways of the steppe. Yasuge had stolen her, quite literally, from another man. She had been traveling to her wedding with a young merkid warrior when Yasuge and his brothers encountered the party. Seeing the beautiful young woman, Yasuge and his brothers gave chase. The merkid warrior, outnumbered and outmatched, fled for his life. Hoilun became Yasuge's wife. This was how things were done on the steppe. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak suffered what they must. When the child was born, they found something remarkable. He came into the world clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, dark as a liver, firm and glistening. The shamans and wise women nodded knowingly at this sign. A child, born grasping blood, was destined for great things, they said. He would be a warrior, a leader, perhaps even a great Khan. They named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain that Yasuge had recently defeated and captured. It was customary to name a child after a vanquished enemy, a way of claiming their strength and courage for the child. Young Temujin grew up in the traditional way of the steppe nomads. Home was not a fixed place, but a felt tent called a gyr or yurt, circular and sturdy, with wooden frames covered in layers of thick wool felt that could withstand the howling winds. These homes could be taken apart and loaded onto wagons in mere hours when it was time to move to new grazing lands. And move they did, constantly. following the grass and water that kept their herds alive. The Mongols were herders first and warriors second, though the two roles were never truly separate. They kept horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels. The horses were small and shaggy, far from the noble steeds of knights in distant lands, but they were incredibly tough. They could survive on sparse grass, endure terrible cold, and run for days without tiring. A Mongol child learned to ride almost before he could walk properly. Temujin was in the saddle by age 3, clinging to the mane of a gentle mare while his father led him around the camp. Life was hard, but not without its joys. There was the kumis, fermented mare's milk that the adults drank, and which made them merry and loud around the evening fires. There was wrestling and archery contests where men proved their skill. There was the music of the morinkhor, the horsehead fiddle, its haunting notes carried on the wind. And there were stories, always stories, of ancestors and heroes, of Bodonchar, the ancestor of the Borjigin clan, of the blue wolf and fallow doe, who were said to be the first parents of the Mongol people. But beneath the surface of this life ran currents of violence and uncertainty. The steppe was divided among countless tribes and clans: Mongols, Tatars, Merkids, Naimans, Karites, and many others. They fought constantly, raiding each other's camps, stealing horses and women, killing rivals, and avenging old grudges that stretched back generations. Blood feuds were the law of the land. If your kinsman was killed, honor demanded that you seek revenge. And so the cycle continued, endlessly. When Temujin was perhaps 9 years old, his father Yasuge took him on a journey to find him a wife. This was customary, to arrange marriages young so that alliances could be formed between families and clans. They traveled to Hualun's home tribe, the Orphaned, where Yasuge hoped to find a suitable girl. Along the way, they met a man named Day Sechin of the Conqueror tribe who had a daughter named Borte. She was perhaps a year older than Temujin, a bright-eyed girl who carried herself with confidence. Day Sechin looked at young Temujin and saw something he liked. Perhaps it was the fierce light in the boy's eyes, or perhaps he simply wanted an alliance with Yasuge's clan. Either way, he agreed to the match. According to custom, Temujin would stay with Borte's family for a time, working for them and proving his worth, while Yasuge returned home with promises of a future wedding. It was a good match, a hopeful beginning. Temujin looked at Borte and felt something stir in his young heart. She would become the love of his life, his empress, the mother of his heirs. But fate had cruel plans in store. Yasuge set out for home alone, traveling back across the steppe toward his camp. Along the way, he encountered a group of Tatars. Now the Tatars and Mongols were old enemies. They had fought for generations, each side nursing grievances and thirsting for revenge. Yasuge had killed many Tatars in his time, and the Tatars had not forgotten. The Tatars he met seemed friendly enough. They were having a feast, they said, and invited him to join them. The steppe had rules of hospitality that were sacred. To refuse food and drink offered in fellowship was a grave insult. Yasuge, perhaps weary from his journey, accepted. They ate and drank together, but the Tatars had recognized him, and they had poisoned his food. By the time Yasuge realized what was happening, it was too late. The poison was working its way through his body, a slow and agonizing death. He made it back to his camp, but he was dying. He called for Temujin to be brought back from Day Sechen's camp, wanting to see his son one last time. But Temujin arrived too late. Yasuge died in terrible pain, his insides burning before his eldest son could return. Temujin was perhaps 9 or 10 years old when his father died. And in that moment, the world he knew collapsed around him. Without a strong chieftain to lead them, Yasuge's followers, the warriors and families who had sworn allegiance to him, made a cold calculation. Hoylun was a widow with young children. Temujin was just a boy, years away from being able to lead warriors into battle. Why should they stay and share their scarce resources with this weakened family? Why should they follow a woman and children? One by one, the families packed up their jars and moved away, taking their herds with them. Hoylun begged them to stay. She rode after them, holding up the clan's banner, the white horsetail standard that was the symbol of their unity. But they ignored her. The new leader of what remained of the clan, a man named Tagutai, drove them away deliberately. He saw Temujin as a potential threat, a boy who might grow up to challenge him for leadership. Better to abandon them now, to let the steppe take care of the problem. And so Temujin, his mother Hoylun, his brothers Kasa, Kajun Temuge, and his half-brother Bekta, along with his sister Temulun, were left alone. They had almost nothing, a few animals, some basic supplies, but no protection, no camp, no warriors to defend them. They were outcasts, the lowest of the low on the steppe, where community and clan were everything. What followed were years of desperate hardship. Hoylun proved to be a woman of remarkable strength and determination. She refused to let her children starve or die. She taught them to dig for roots, to catch fish in the rivers with hooks made from needles, to hunt small game with their weak bows. They ate marmots, field mice, anything they could catch. In winter, they nearly froze. In summer, they roasted under the merciless sun. Other tribes who encountered them might throw them scraps, but more often they were robbed of what little they had. Temujin grew up fast in those brutal years. The boy who might have been raised as the son of a chieftain, learning warfare and leadership in relative comfort, instead learned survival in its rawest form. He learned what it meant to go to bed with an empty stomach. He learned what it meant to be despised, to be laughed at, to have nothing and no one. And he learned to hate. He hated the Tatars who had poisoned his father. He hated Tagutai who had abandoned his family. He hated the world that had taken everything from him. But perhaps most terrible was what happened between the brothers. Food was scarce, and tensions ran high. Temujin and his full brother Kasar were the oldest and strongest. Bekta was their half-brother, born of a different mother. The two groups competed for every scrap. One day, Bekta stole a fish that Temujin had caught, and a lark that Kasar had shot with an arrow. It was a small thing, but in their desperate circumstances, it was everything. Temujin and Kasar hunted Bekta down like an animal. They found him sitting on a hillside. Bekta knew why they had come. He could see it in their eyes. He did not beg or run. He only asked that they spare their youngest brother, Belgoti. Then Temujin and Kasar shot him dead with arrows, their own brother, killed over a fish and a bird. Hoylun was furious when she learned what her sons had done. She called them monsters, destroyers of their own kin, compared them to wild beasts. But the deed was done. Bekta was buried on the steppe, and the family carried on, now one member fewer. Temujin had learned another lesson that day. He had learned that he could kill, even someone close to him if survival demanded it. He had learned that mercy was a luxury the weak could not afford. The years of hardship continued. When Temujin was perhaps 14 or 15, Tagutai and his men found him. They feared, rightly, that this dispossessed boy might grow up to challenge them, might seek revenge for his family's abandonment. They captured Temujin and put him in a gangway, a heavy wooden collar that locked around the neck, designed to humiliate and restrain prisoners. He was paraded through their camps, a warning to others, a piece of property to be displayed. But Temujin was not broken. One night, during a feast when his captors were drunk on kumis, he struck the guard watching him with his wooden collar, stunning the man, and fled into the darkness. He hid in a river, submerged up to his nose in the cold water, while they searched for him. A man from the camp, someone who perhaps saw something in the fierce young prisoner, helped him escape, hiding him in a cart of wool and later releasing him. Temujin made his way back to his family, free but more determined than ever. He had been beaten, starved, abandoned, enslaved, and he had survived it all. The steppe had tried to kill him in every way possible, and he had refused to die. Something had hardened inside him, something cold and fierce and utterly ruthless. The boy was becoming the man, and that man would one day make the entire world tremble. But that is a story for another part of our evening. For now, let us rest here, with young Temujin returned to his family, alive against all odds, beginning to understand what he must become if he is ever to rise above the cruel fate the steppe has dealt him. As Temujin entered his late teens, he began to understand that survival alone was not enough. To truly live on the steppe, to reclaim what his father had lost, he would need more than just his immediate family. He would need followers, warriors, allies. He would need to transform himself from a hunted outcast into someone others would choose to follow. And so began the slow, careful work of building power from nothing. His first move was bold, perhaps even reckless. He sought out Togrul, the Khan of the Kerit tribe, one of the most powerful confederations on the steppe. Togrul was also known as Ong Khan, or Wang Khan, a title granted by distant Chinese emperors. More importantly, Togrul had once been Anda, a sworn brother to Temujin's father Yasugehi. They had fought together, shared blood oaths, and supported each other in the complicated web of steppe politics. Temujin presented himself at Togrul's camp, with nothing but his fierce determination and his father's name. He came as a supplicant, not a proud warrior. He acknowledged Togrul as a father figure, offered his loyalty, and asked for protection and support. It was a gamble. Togrul could have turned him away, or worse, handed him over to his enemies. But the old Khan saw something in this intense young man. Perhaps he remembered Yasuge fondly. Perhaps he calculated that supporting Temujin might gain him a useful ally in the future. Either way, Togrul agreed to take Temujin under his protection. This alliance gave Temujin something precious: legitimacy. Now he was not just a landless outcast, but someone connected to a powerful Khan. Others began to see him differently. Around this same time, Temujin renewed another crucial relationship with Jamuka. Jamuka was roughly the same age as Temujin, the son of a minor chief from another Mongol clan. They had been friends as boys, before Yasuge's death had torn Temujin's world apart. Now, they met again as young men. They renewed their friendship in the most sacred way the Mongols knew. They became Anda, sworn brothers. The ceremony was solemn and binding. They exchanged gifts, golden belts and fine horses. They swore oaths to be as one person, to share everything, to support each other until death. For a time, this bond would be genuine. Jamuka and Temujin truly seemed to care for each other, to respect each other's abilities. But the seeds of future conflict were already there, planted in their different natures and different dreams. With Toral's backing and Jamuka's brotherhood, Temujin began to attract followers. At first just a handful, then more. Young men looking for a strong leader, families seeking protection, even some of his father's old warriors who had abandoned Hoylun years ago, but now saw opportunity in the sun. Temujin welcomed them all, but he never forgot who had stood by his family in the dark times and who had not. Memory was long on the steppe, and Temujin's memory was longer than most. Now came the time to fulfill an old promise. Temujin returned to the Conqueror tribe, to Day Sechen's camp, to claim Borte as his bride. She had waited for him through all the terrible years, her father keeping faith with the arrangement made when they were children. When Temujin arrived, he was no longer the dispossessed boy who had stayed in their years before. He was a young warrior with growing prestige, backed by powerful allies. The marriage went forward with proper ceremony. Day Sechen gave his daughter a magnificent wedding gift, a coat of black sable fur, incredibly valuable. Temujin immediately understood the political importance of this gift. He took the sable coat and presented it to Togrul, further cementing their relationship. It was a shrewd move, one that showed Temujin was learning to navigate the complex politics of the steppe, where gifts and obligations were as important as swords and arrows. Temujin and Borte began their life together. He built his own camp, modest but growing, along the Kerlin River. For a brief time, there was something approaching peace and happiness. Borte was strong-willed and intelligent, a true partner rather than just a wife. Temujin valued her counsel throughout his life. She would bear him 4 sons, Yoki, Chagatai, Ogade, and Tolui, who would help him conquer the world and inherit his empire. But before any of that joy could be fully realized, tragedy struck again. The Merkid tribe had not forgotten that Yasuge had stolen Hoylun from one of their warriors decades ago. Blood debts on the steppe were paid across generations. To the Merkids, Temujin was Yasuge's son, and thus responsible for his father's crimes. They plotted their revenge carefully. In a dawn raid, 300 Merkid horsemen swept down on Temujin's small camp like a thunderstorm. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Temujin had no hope of fighting off so many warriors. He had only moments to act. He grabbed his brothers, his mother, and his closest companions and fled into the forest on Mount Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain where he had hidden as a boy. But in the chaos and darkness, Borte was left behind. The old woman who was caring for her that night hid the young bride in a cart and tried to flee, but the merkids found them. They took Borte captive and rode away into the night. Temujin emerged from hiding at dawn to find his camp ransacked and his wife gone. The grief and rage he felt were absolute. Borte was not just his wife, but his partner, his future, the mother of the sons he hoped to have. The merkids had struck him in the most personal, most painful way possible, and they had made a terrible mistake. They had shown Temujin what he must become if he was ever to be safe, ever to protect what was his. He must become so powerful, so feared, that no one would ever dare to strike at him or his again. Temujin went immediately to Togrul, his protector. He begged the old Khan to help him rescue Borte. He swore eternal loyalty, promised anything and everything. Togrul agreed. He would provide 20,000 warriors. But Temujin did not stop there. He rode to Yamuka's camp and called upon his sworn brother's oath. Yamuka, to his credit, did not hesitate. He pledged his own warriors, another 20,000. It was an enormous force, far more than would normally be gathered for a single raid. But this was personal for all of them. Togrul was avenging his old friend Yasuge. Yamuka was honoring his under oath. And Temujin was getting his wife back and teaching the merkids what happened to those who struck at him. The combined army rode north to the merkid lands. They moved fast, giving the enemy no time to prepare or scatter. When they found the main merkid camp, they attacked at dawn, just as the merkids had attacked Temujin. It was brutal and one-sided. The merkid warriors, caught by surprise and vastly outnumbered, were cut down or scattered. Their camps were destroyed, their herds seized, their women and children taken as captives, just as they had done to others so many times before. Temujin rode through the chaos searching for Borte. He called her name over and over, and then incredibly, he heard her voice calling back. She had heard his voice and recognized it even amid the screaming and confusion. She ran toward him through the smoke and terror. When they found each other, they embraced as though they would never let go. Temujin had gotten his wife back, but the reunion was not without complications. Borte had been a captive for months. She had been given to one of the merkid chiefs as a wife, a punishment meant to mirror what Yasuge had done to them. When Temujin and Borte were finally alone, they had to confront what had happened. Borte was pregnant. She gave birth 9 months later to a son they named Jochi, which means guest or visitor in Mongolian. The name itself spoke volumes. Was Jochi truly Temujin's son, or the son of the merkid chief who had held Borte captive? Temujin chose to acknowledge Jochi as his firstborn son. Publicly, he never questioned the boy's paternity. But the doubt was there, unspoken but always present. And as the years went by, it became clear that Temujin favored his other sons, especially Ogyedei and Tolui, over Jochi. Chagatai, the second son, grew to openly despise his older brother, calling him the merkid bastard. These family tensions would have consequences long after Temujin's death, when the empire would be divided among his descendants. But that was in the future. For now, the successful rescue of Borte had dramatically increased Temujin's prestige. He had called upon powerful allies, and they had answered. He had led a successful military operation. warriors who had been watching him, wondering if he was worth following, now began to come to his banner. Men who respected strength and success saw that this young man, barely into his 20s, had both. Word spread across the steppe. Temujin was someone to watch, someone who paid his debts and protected his own. His camp grew larger. More families came seeking his protection. More warriors pledged their swords to him. The handful of followers became dozens, then hundreds. And with growth came resources: horses, sheep, goats, cattle. The wealth of the steppe was measured in animals, and Temujin's herds were growing. He began to organize his followers in new ways. The old tribal system was based on blood ties, on loyalty to one's clan and family above all. But Temujin had learned the weakness of that system. Blood relatives had abandoned his mother when she needed them most. Sworn allies had proven more reliable than kinsmen. So he started to build a different kind of loyalty, one based on merit and mutual benefit rather than just birth. He rewarded competence and bravery regardless of a man's background. If a slave proved himself in battle, Temujin might elevate him to command. If a noble proved useless or cowardly, he might be demoted or cast out. This was revolutionary on the steppe, where bloodlines and noble birth were supposed to determine a man's worth, but Temujin cared only about results. Can you fight? Can you lead? Are you loyal? Those were the questions that mattered. He also began to show the qualities that would define his leadership for the rest of his life. He was generous to those who served him well, sharing plunder and giving gifts. He was absolutely ruthless to those who betrayed him or stood in his way. He valued loyalty above almost everything else, and he never, ever forgot a slight or a kindness. Years later, he would reward an enemy who had shown him mercy when he was a prisoner. Decades later, he would destroy the descendants of those who had wronged his family. Around his campfires at night, as his followers ate and drank, Temujin would speak of his vision, not just survival, not just revenge, but something greater. He spoke of uniting all the Mongol tribes, of ending the endless feuds and raids, of creating one people under one law. To most of his listeners, this seemed like an impossible dream. The Mongols had been divided for as long as anyone could remember, but Temujin spoke with such conviction, such fierce determination, that men began to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, this strange, intense young man might actually do it. Jamuka watched his sworn brothers rise with mixed feelings. He was proud of Temujin's success, or so he told himself. But he was also uneasy. Jamuka came from noble blood. He believed in the old ways, in the importance of proper lineage and traditional authority. Temujin's meritocracy, his willingness to elevate commoners and former enemies, troubled Jamuka. And beneath the unease was something darker, jealousy, perhaps, or ambition. Jamuka also dreamed of leading the Mongol people, but his vision was different from Temujin's. Where Temujin dreamed of unity through strength and new systems, Jamuka imagined himself as first among equals, a high Khan who ruled through noble birth and coalition. For now, the two sworn brothers remained outwardly friendly, but the crack in their relationship was there, small but growing, like a fissure in ice on a spring river. Soon enough, that crack would split wide open, and the steppe would run red with blood as the two friends became the bitterest of enemies. But that reckoning still lay ahead. For now, Temujin continued to rise, slowly but surely, from the desperate poverty of his youth towards something none of them could yet imagine: absolute power over all the tribes of the steppe, and through them, over a significant portion of the entire world. The steppe in those days was a puzzle of peoples, scattered and fractured into countless pieces. To understand what Temujin accomplished, you must first understand what he faced. The Mongols themselves were not one unified people, but dozens of separate tribes and clans. The Taichud, the Jadaran, the Borjigin, the Kongarad, and many others. Each had their own chiefs, their own grazing lands, their own feuds and alliances. And beyond the Mongols were other groups entirely. The Tatars to the east, ancient enemies. The Merkids to the north, still smarting from their defeat. The Karets under Togrul, Christian warriors who had adopted the faith from distant Nestorian missionaries. The Naimans to the west, wealthy and powerful. And beyond them all, the great kingdoms, China to the south, divided between the Jin Empire and the southern Song Dynasty, and further west the Islamic lands of Central Asia. The steppe folk were divided into what they called the people of the white Jota and the people of the black Jota. The white Jota people were the noble families, the aristocrats who claimed descent from ancient heroes and expected to rule by right of blood. The black Jota people were everyone else, the commoners, the herders, the ordinary warriors. This division was supposed to be eternal and unchangeable. You were born into your station, and there you remained. Jamuka was very much a creature of this old system. He came from a prestigious bloodline and believed that the white Jota people should naturally lead. Temujin, though technically of noble blood through his father, had grown up in poverty and desperation. He had seen how the old system had failed his family, how noble relatives had abandoned his mother without a second thought. He would remember that always. The breaking point between Temujin and Jamuka came over something seemingly small but deeply symbolic. The two had been camping together, their followers intermingled, moving across the steppe as one large group. One evening, Jamuka suggested they separate, saying that those who herded horses should camp apart from those who herded sheep. It seemed like a practical suggestion about managing different types of animals, but the meaning underneath was clear to everyone listening. Jamuka was proposing a separation based on the old divisions, the mounted warriors of noble families apart from the common herders. It was a statement about hierarchy and proper order. Temujin understood immediately what Jamuka was really saying. That night, without announcing his intentions, he broke camp and moved his followers away from Jamuka's group. It was a deliberate rejection of Jamuka's worldview, a declaration that Temujin would not accept the old order of nobility ruling over commoners simply by right of birth. Many of Jamuka's own followers, especially those of common birth, who had felt looked down upon, chose to follow Temujin instead. This defection infuriated Jamuka and hurt him deeply. His sworn brother, his Anda, had rejected him publicly and stolen his people. The friendship was over. Now began a rivalry that would define the next phase of Temujin's rise. Jamuka had more initial support among the traditional nobility. Many of the old powerful families preferred his vision of a confederation where they would maintain their privileges and status. But Temujin had something more powerful. He had the loyalty of those he elevated, the gratitude of those he rewarded based on merit, and the fierce devotion of those who saw in him a path to rise above their lowly births. In 1201, a great gathering of tribes proclaimed Jamuka as Gurkhan universal ruler. It was a direct challenge to Temujin. The steppe could not support two men claiming supreme authority. War was inevitable. The two forces met in battle. It was brutal and bloody. Former friends killing each other, families torn apart by competing loyalties. The first major engagement ended inconclusively, with both sides claiming victory. But over time, a pattern emerged. Jamuka might win noble support, but he struggled to hold it. His arrogance, his insistence on traditional privilege, alienated many. Meanwhile, Temujin's ranks kept growing. Warriors deserted Jamuka to join Temujin, drawn by his reputation for fairness and generosity to those who served him well. But Temujin faced other challenges beyond Jamuka. His relationship with Togrul, his protector and almost father, began to deteriorate. Togrul's son, Sengum, was jealous of Temujin and saw him as a rival for his father's favor and eventual inheritance of the Karaite leadership. Sengum whispered poison into his father's ear, warning that Temujin was growing too powerful, that he would eventually turn on them. For a time, Togrul resisted these arguments. He had genuine affection for Temujin, but as Temujin's power grew, the old Khan began to worry. Perhaps his son was right. Perhaps this young man he had helped raise up would indeed become a threat. The crisis came when Temujin proposed a marriage alliance between his family and Togrul's. He suggested that his eldest son Yoshi marry Togrul's daughter, cementing their bond through blood. Sengum was outraged by the suggestion. He saw it as presumptuous, an upstart trying to marry into his noble family. He convinced his father to not only refuse the proposal, but to prepare an ambush. They invited Temujin to a feast to discuss the marriage. Temujin, fortunately, had his own spies and informants. One of them, a man who had reason to be grateful to Temujin, sent warning of the trap. Temujin did not attend the feast. Instead, he confronted Togrul directly about the betrayal. The old Khan, caught between his son's schemes and his affection for Temujin, wavered. For a time, they patched up their relationship, but the trust was broken. Sengum made another attempt on Temujin's life, and this time there could be no forgiveness. War broke out between them. It was heartbreaking for Temujin in some ways. Togrul had been like a father to him, but Temujin had learned long ago that survival required ruthlessness. Sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. The war against the Carets was desperate at first. They were numerous and well-equipped. There were battles where Temujin's forces were badly outnumbered and nearly destroyed. But Temujin had advantages that went beyond numbers. His warriors were fanatically loyal. His intelligence network was excellent, and he had learned to use terrain and weather to his advantage. He would strike when and where the enemy least expected, then fade away before they could bring their full strength to bear. The decisive battle came at a place called Jeje Heights. Temujin's forces managed to isolate and surround a large portion of the Keret army. The fighting lasted 3 days and 3 nights, an unheard-of length for steppe warfare, which usually consisted of quick skirmishes and raids. The grass was trampled to mud, and that mud was soaked red with blood. Men fought until they could barely lift their swords. In the end, the Kerates broke. Togrul fled with a small group of followers, but was killed by Naimans who did not recognize him. Sengum escaped into exile, where he would die unmourned and forgotten. Temujin had destroyed one of the most powerful confederations on the steppe. He absorbed the surviving Kerets into his own forces, taking their warriors, their herds, and their lands. More importantly, he had proved that he could defeat a major rival, that his new system of leadership based on merit and loyalty could triumph over the old noble confederations. Chiefs and warriors across the steppe took note. Temujin was no longer just a rising power. He was now one of the major players in the game of steppe politics. But there was still Yamuka to deal with. The rivalry between the two former friends had become the defining conflict of the age. They chased each other across the grasslands, fought battles and skirmishes, raided each other's camps, and competed for every alliance and every follower. But increasingly Temujin was winning. Even some of Jamuka's closest companions began to doubt him. He could be cruel to his own followers, executing men for small failures, displaying the arrogance that came with his noble birth. After one defeat, Jamuka killed several dozen captives by boiling them alive in 70 cauldrons. It was meant to terrify his enemies, but instead it horrified many of his own allies. In the end, Jamuka's own men betrayed him. They captured him and handed him over to Temujin, hoping for reward. Temujin, however, showed his contempt for traitors. He executed the men who had betrayed their leader, saying that anyone who would betray their rightful chief could never be trusted. Then he faced his old friend. Jamuka knew he was finished. He asked only that Temujin kill him without spilling his blood, which according to Mongol belief meant crushing or breaking the body so that the blood remained inside. It was considered a more honorable death, preserving the spirit. Temujin granted this final request. Jamuka was executed and his body was laid to rest with proper ceremony. Despite everything, Temujin had loved this man once, and he mourned the necessity of his death. Now, only one major force stood between Temujin and dominance of the Mongol peoples, the Naiman Confederation to the west. The Naimans were wealthy and powerful. They had absorbed refugees from all the other defeated tribes. Their Khan, Taiyang, looked at Temujin with contempt, calling him an upstart and bragging that he would crush this minor chief and take his wife Borta for himself. This was a fatal miscalculation. Temujin prepared carefully for the war against the Naimans. He gathered intelligence about their movements and their strengths. He drilled his warriors in new tactics, and when he was ready, he struck. The decisive battle took place at the Kongai Mountains in 1204. Temujin used a clever trick. He had each of his warriors light multiple campfires at night, making his force appear much larger than it really was. The Naimans, seeing what they thought was an enormous army, panicked. In the battle that followed, Taiyang was wounded and captured. He died from his wounds, and the Naiman Confederation shattered. With the Naimans defeated, Temujin controlled virtually all the Mongol peoples and many of the neighboring tribes. But there was still work to do. The Tatars, those ancient enemies who had poisoned his father, still existed as a distinct group. Temujin's revenge upon them was total and terrible. He ordered that every Tatar male taller than the height of a cart axle should be killed. This meant every man and boy old enough to fight. It was genocide, pure and simple, the near total extermination of an entire people. The surviving Tatar women and children were distributed among the Mongol tribes, absorbed and assimilated. The Tatars as a distinct ethnic group ceased to exist. This horrific act served multiple purposes. It was personal revenge for his father. It was a demonstration of what happened to those who opposed Temujin. And it eliminated a group that could never be trusted to remain loyal, given the centuries of bad blood. It was ruthless and effective, and it sent a clear message to everyone else on the steppe. Submit to Temujin or be destroyed. There would be no third option. By 1206, after decades of warfare, betrayal, alliance, and conquest, Temujin had achieved something no one had ever accomplished before. He had united all the Mongol tribes under a single leader. The fractured puzzle of peoples had become one. The endless feuding and raiding had ceased, at least among the Mongols themselves. It was time to formalize what he had created. It was time for a great gathering, a Kurultai, where all the chiefs and leaders would assemble to acknowledge what had been won and to decide what came next. The Kurultai was held near the source of the Onon River, not far from where Temujin had been born 40-some years earlier. It was a grand affair. Thousands upon thousands of warriors assembled, their white jurta filling the valley like a field of mushrooms after rain. The great chiefs came, the surviving nobles who had chosen wisely to support Temujin, and the new men he had elevated from common birth to positions of authority. They came to bear witness and to acclaim. Before the assembled multitude, on a platform draped with white felt, the sacred color of the steppe, Temujin was proclaimed Khan of all Khans, Genghis Khan. The name itself has been debated by scholars for centuries. It might mean universal ruler, or oceanic ruler, or fierce ruler. The exact translation is less important than the concept. He was not merely a Khan, one leader among many. He was the Khan, supreme and absolute, the ruler of all the peoples of the felt-walled tents, the lord of the steppe itself. The boy who had dug for roots to survive had become the master of millions. The outcast who owned nothing now commanded the greatest cavalry force the world had ever seen, and he was just getting started. The unification of the Mongols was not an end, but a beginning. Now, with his people united and organized, Genghis Khan would turn his attention outward, toward the wealthy kingdoms that surrounded the steppe, toward the cities filled with treasure, toward conquest on a scale that would make all his previous achievements seem like mere preparation. The world had no idea what was coming for it, but it would learn soon enough. Let us linger a moment on that great gathering by the Onon River in the year 1206, for it was one of the most important days in all of human history, though few realized it at the time. The Kurultai was not merely a celebration or a ceremony. It was the moment when chaos became order, when a collection of feuding tribes became a nation, when Temujin transformed himself from a mortal man into something approaching legend. Picture, if you will, the scene. A vast plain beside the river, the grass still green from spring rains, the sky that endless blue that only exists in the high country of Mongolia. Thousands of white felt jurta dotted the landscape. Smoke rose from countless cooking fires. The air was filled with the sounds of a great gathering, the whinnying of tens of thousands of horses, the bleating of sheep and goats, the laughter and conversation of warriors who just months before might have been trying to kill each other. Children ran between the jurta playing games. Women cooked and gossiped. Old men told stories of battles long past, and at the center of it all, on a raised platform covered in the finest white felt, stood Temujin, soon to be proclaimed Genghis Khan. He was in his 40s by now, not young, but not yet old. His face bore the marks of a hard life, scars from countless battles, lines carved by wind and sun and cold. But his eyes still burned with that fierce intensity that had characterized him since boyhood. He wore simple clothes, not the elaborate robes one might expect of a supreme ruler. Genghis Khan never cared much for personal luxury. He ate simple food, lived in a simple hurta, and dressed practically. Power for him was not about comfort or display. It was about control, about the ability to make his will reality. The ceremony itself was rooted in ancient Mongol traditions. The chiefs came forward one by one to swear their oaths of loyalty. They bent at their knees, something the proud warriors of the steppe rarely did, and pledged their lives and the lives of their followers to Genghis Khan. In return, he acknowledged each man, calling them by name, sometimes recalling specific deeds they had done in his service. He had a remarkable memory for faces and actions. A man who had fought bravely in a minor skirmish years ago might find himself remembered and rewarded now. Loyalty to Genghis Khan was never forgotten, just as betrayal was never forgiven. But Genghis Khan understood that ceremonies and oaths were not enough. If the Mongol nation was to remain united, if it was to accomplish the great things he envisioned, it needed structure and organization. So in the days and weeks following his proclamation, he set about creating the systems that would govern his empire. And in doing so, he revealed himself to be not just a brilliant warrior, but also an exceptional administrator and lawgiver. First came the military organization, the old tribal system, where men fought alongside their kinsmen under clan chiefs, was abolished. Instead, Genghis Khan organized his entire army into a decimal system. The basic unit was the arban, 10 men. 10 arban made a zun, 100 men. 10 zun made a mingan, 1,000. And 10 mingan made a tumen, 10,000, the largest formal military unit. This system had several advantages. It was simple and easy to understand. It broke up the old tribal loyalties, mixing men from different backgrounds in the same units. And it made the army incredibly flexible. Forces could be divided or combined quickly as needed. Each unit had a commander responsible for training, discipline, and the welfare of his men. These commanders were chosen for competence, not noble birth. A brilliant leader of common origins could command a tumen, while a useless nobleman might find himself a simple warrior in the ranks. This pure meritocracy was revolutionary. It meant that the Mongol army was led by its most capable warriors, not its most well-born. Every soldier knew that bravery and skill could elevate him. Every commander knew that failure would result in demotion or worse. The discipline was harsh but fair. Cowardice in battle was punished by death, not just of the coward, but sometimes of his entire army. This created tremendous pressure for units to fight together, to support each other, because one man's failure could doom his comrades. But bravery was also rewarded generously. A warrior who distinguished himself might receive extra shares of plunder, promotion, even land and herds. Genghis Khan understood motivation better than perhaps any commander before him. Then there was the Yasa, the law code that Genghis Khan established to govern his empire. Before the Yasa, law on the steppe was a patchwork of tribal customs, blood feuds, and the arbitrary decisions of chiefs. The Yasa changed all that. It was a comprehensive legal system covering everything from theft to murder to military discipline. And it applied to everyone from the highest noble to the lowliest herder. Even Genghis Khan's own sons and relatives were subject to the Yasa. When one of his grandsons was found guilty of a crime, he was punished according to the law despite his imperial blood. The Yasa was severe. Theft could result in death. Adultery could result in death. Betrayal certainly resulted in death. But it was also remarkably fair and progressive in some ways. It mandated religious tolerance, something almost unheard of in that age. Genghis Khan's empire would come to include Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and shamans, all free to practice their faiths without persecution. He himself remained a shamanist, believing in the sky god Tengri and the spirits of nature, but he respected the beliefs of others and saw no reason to force conformity. The Yasa also protected trade and travelers. Merchants could move freely across Mongol lands without fear of being robbed. Roads were patrolled. Rest stations were established. Anyone who harmed a merchant or envoy faced terrible punishment. Genghis Khan understood that trade brought wealth, and wealthy subjects were easier to govern and tax than poor ones. The revival of the Silk Road, the great trade route connecting East and West, can be traced directly to the peace and security the Mongols imposed. One of the most important innovations was the Yam system, a network of relay stations spread across the empire. These stations, spaced a day's hard ride apart, maintained fresh horses, food, and shelter. Imperial messengers could use the Yam to travel enormous distances at incredible speed, changing horses at each station and riding on without stopping. News and orders could travel from one end of the empire to the other in mere weeks, something impossible in any other realm of that era. The Yam gave Genghis Khan something invaluable: information and control over his vast territories. Genghis Khan also recognized that the Mongols, for all their military skill, lacked certain knowledge and technologies possessed by settled peoples. So he made it his policy to spare and recruit skilled craftsmen, engineers, scholars, and administrators from the lands he conquered. When a city fell, soldiers and nobles might be massacred, but scribes, doctors, engineers, and craftsmen were gathered up and sent back to Mongolia or assigned to the army. These men taught the Mongols about siege warfare, about building catapults and siege towers, about managing cities and collecting taxes efficiently. The Mongol Empire became a great melting pot of knowledge, drawing on Chinese, Persian, and European expertise. The adoption of writing was another crucial step. The Mongols had been an illiterate people, relying entirely on oral tradition and memory. Genghis Khan captured an Uyghur scribe during his campaigns and had him adapt the Uyghur script, which itself was derived from the Aramaic alphabet used in the Middle East for writing Mongolian. Suddenly, laws could be written down and distributed, orders could be sent in writing, records could be kept. This might seem simple to us now, but it was transformative for the Mongols. Genghis Khan organized his empire into units called ulus, essentially territories assigned to his sons and major commanders. Each ulus was semi-autonomous, governed by its assigned leader, but all owed ultimate allegiance to the Great Khan. His sons received the most important assignments. Yoki, despite the questions about his paternity, received the Western territories. Chagatai got the lands of Central Asia. Ogedai, his favorite, was designated as his successor and received territory in the center of the empire. Tolui, the youngest, would inherit the Mongol heartland according to Mongol custom. Among his generals, Genghis Khan's choices revealed his genius for recognizing talent. Subutai, who would become perhaps the greatest general of the age, was the son of a blacksmith, a man of no noble blood whatsoever. But Genghis Khan saw his brilliance and elevated him to supreme command. Jebi, whose name means arrow, had once fought against Genghis Khan and even shot the great Khan's horse out from under him in battle. When captured, instead of lying, Jebi admitted to the deed. Genghis Khan, impressed by his honesty and skill, not only spared him but made him one of his most trusted generals. These men would go on to conquer kingdoms and terrify continents. He also created the Kishig, an imperial guard of 10,000 warriors chosen from the best fighters in the army. But the Kishig was more than just bodyguards. It was a training ground for future commanders, a pool of absolutely loyal warriors who could be sent on crucial missions, and a powerful symbol of the Khan's authority. To serve in the Keshig was a great honor, and competition for positions was fierce. All of these reforms and innovations shared a common thread. They were practical, designed to work, not to conform to tradition or ideology. Genghis Khan cared about results. If something worked, he kept it. If it did not, he discarded it without sentiment. This pragmatism, combined with his willingness to learn from others, made him and his empire extraordinarily adaptable and effective. By the time the Kurultai dispersed and the tribes returned to their territories, the Mongol nation had been transformed. It was no longer a loose collection of feuding clans, but a unified state with a single leader, a common law, and a powerful, well-organized army. And that army, perhaps 200,000 strong, the finest cavalry force ever assembled, was now idle. Genghis Khan had united the steppe. But steppe grass and herds of animals, while sufficient for survival, did not fulfill his ambitions or satisfy his warriors' desire for wealth and glory. So Genghis Khan looked outward, beyond the horizons of the grasslands, toward the great civilizations that surrounded his realm. To the south lay China, divided but fabulously wealthy, with cities full of silk and gold and treasures beyond counting. To the west lay the rich kingdoms of Central Asia and the Middle East, oasis cities strung like jewels along the Silk Road. These were the prizes that awaited. The unification of the Mongols was complete. Now would begin the conquest of the world. The Silk Road, that ancient thread connecting east and west, had for centuries been the lifeline of trade across Asia. Silk, spices, jade, and countless other treasures flowed along this route from the markets of China to the bazaars of Persia and beyond. But the Silk Road did not pass through empty wilderness. It was controlled, taxed, and sometimes blocked by the kingdoms and empires along its length. And for the Mongols, newly unified and hungry for the wealth of settled lands, the Silk Road was both opportunity and objective. The first target was obvious. The Western Xia, also called the Tangut Empire, controlled a crucial section of the Silk Road, where it passed through the corridor between the Gobi Desert and the mountains of Tibet. The Tanguts were not Chinese, though they had adopted much of Chinese culture and writing. They were originally a Tibetan people who had built a prosperous kingdom by controlling trade routes and extracting tribute from the merchant caravans that passed through their territory. Their capital, Zhongxing, was a wealthy city, and their army was substantial, perhaps 150,000 men. In 1205, Genghis Khan launched a probing raid into Tangut territory. It was as much reconnaissance as conquest, a way of testing this enemy's strength and training his army in fighting against settled peoples who defended from walled cities. The raid was successful enough. The Mongols swept through the countryside, seizing livestock and plunder, then withdrew before the Tangut army could bring its full strength to bear. But Genghis Khan had learned what he needed to know. The Tanguts were wealthy. Their armies fought in the Chinese style with infantry and cavalry combined, and they relied heavily on fortifications. Taking their cities would require new tactics. The real invasion came in 1209. This time, Genghis Khan brought his full strength and his determination to conquer, not just raid. The Mongol army poured across the border like a flood. The Tangut forces met them in open battle and were destroyed. The Mongol cavalry, with their composite bows and brilliant horsemanship, simply outmaneuvered and outfought the Tangut warriors. But victories in the field were only the beginning. The cities remained, protected by their walls. Siege warfare was foreign to the Mongols. Men who lived in felt tents and moved with the seasons had no tradition of building or breaking stone walls. But Genghis Khan was nothing if not adaptable. He captured Chinese and Tangut engineers and forced them to serve him. He learned about siege engines, catapults that could hurl stones to smash gates and walls, siege towers that could bring warriors up to the height of battlements, and battering rams that could pound through wooden gates. The Mongols proved remarkably quick students of this new art. City after city fell. Some surrendered when they saw the Mongol army approaching, hoping for mercy. Those that submitted were usually spared, though they had to pay tribute and provide supplies. Cities that resisted faced the full terror of Mongol siegecraft. The Mongols would surround a city completely, cutting off all supplies. They would drive captured civilians, sometimes thousands of them, ahead of their assault forces, using them as human shields. It was ruthless and effective, and it was terrifying. Word spread quickly. Resist the Mongols and face total destruction. Submit and you might survive. By 1210, the Tanguts were beaten. They sued for peace, agreeing to become vassals of the Mongol Empire, to pay annual tribute, and to provide troops for Genghis Khan's armies. The Western Xia would continue to exist as a state for now, but it was firmly under Mongol control. And crucially, the Mongols now controlled a vital section of the Silk Road. Wealth began to flow into Genghis Khan's treasury. His warriors, who had known only the sparse lifestyle of herders, began to taste the riches of conquest. But the Western Xia was merely an appetizer. The main course lay beyond, in the heartland of China itself. The Jin Dynasty, ruled by the Orphaned people, controlled northern China, including the ancient capital of Kaifeng and the more recent capital of Zhongdu, which we know today as Beijing. The Jin Empire was enormous, with a population in the tens of millions, a sophisticated bureaucracy, a powerful army, and wealth that made the Tanguts look poor by comparison. The Jin had conquered northern China from the Song dynasty nearly a century earlier, and had forced the Song to retreat south of the Yangtze River. They were a proven military power, not to be underestimated. Genghis Khan had several reasons to attack the Jin. There was the obvious attraction of their wealth. There was the strategic consideration that a powerful empire on his southern border was a potential threat. But there was also a personal element. The Jin had long treated the Mongol tribes as barbarians, useful as mercenaries sometimes, but never as equals. Mongol chiefs who visited the Jin court were expected to kneel and bow to acknowledge their inferior status. Genghis Khan remembered these humiliations, and he meant to repay them 1,000-fold. The war against the Jin began in 1211. It would last on and off for more than 20 years, continuing even after Genghis Khan's own death. It was a conflict on a scale that dwarfed anything the Mongols had known on the steppe. The Jin could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Their cities were enormous, protected by walls so thick and high that they seemed impregnable. Their weapons included gunpowder bombs, fire lances that were the ancestors of guns, and sophisticated crossbows that could punch through armor. The early campaigns followed the pattern established against the Tanguts. The Mongols would invade, defeat Jin armies in open battle, besiege and capture cities, then withdraw as winter approached or when Jin reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. It was war of attrition bleeding the Jin Empire. While the Mongols learned and adapted each campaign, the Mongols became more skilled at siege warfare. They recruited more Chinese engineers and soldiers who brought knowledge of Jin tactics and fortifications. They learned to use captured Jin weapons, including the gunpowder devices. One of Genghis Khan's great strengths was his willingness to learn from anyone, even enemies. When Chinese generals defected to his side, as several did when they saw which way the wind was blowing, he welcomed them and gave them commands. When Muslim merchants from Central Asia arrived in his camps offering trade goods and information, he listened to their descriptions of the wider world beyond China. His army was becoming more than just Mongol horsemen. It was incorporating the best elements of every military tradition it encountered. The Mongols also refined their use of terror as a weapon. When a city resisted and was eventually taken, the consequences were horrific. The population would be driven out into the open. Then, systematically, the Mongols would kill everyone. Men, women, children, the elderly. No one was spared. Sometimes they would leave a handful of survivors deliberately, people whose sole purpose was to flee to other cities and spread the tale of what had happened. The message was clear and simple. Surrender immediately, and you will live, and pay tribute. Resist, and you and everyone you love will die. It was psychological warfare on a grand scale, and it was terrifyingly effective. In 1213, Genghis Khan led a major campaign that broke through the fortifications protecting northern China and swept down to the very gates of Zhongdu, the Jin capital. The city was huge, one of the largest in the world at that time, with perhaps 1 million inhabitants protected by massive walls. The Mongols besieged it, but they could not take it quickly, so they settled in for a long siege, cutting off supplies and waiting for starvation to do their work for them. The Jin court was in chaos. The emperor had fled south to Kaifeng, abandoning Chengdu and its people. The officials and generals left in the city faced an impossible situation. They could not break the siege with the forces they had. Relief armies were defeated before they could reach the city. Food was running out. People were already starving. In desperation, they offered Genghis Khan an enormous bribe to lift the siege. Gold, silver, silk, horses, and even imperial princesses to become his wives or concubines. The treasure they offered was staggering, enough to enrich every Mongol warrior. Genghis Khan accepted. He had learned that sometimes letting an enemy survive and pay tribute was more profitable than destroying them completely. The siege was lifted, and the Mongols withdrew, laden with treasure beyond anything they had ever imagined. The common Mongol warrior, who a decade earlier had been a simple herder living in a felt tent, now owned silk robes and had gold in his purse. The taste of Chinese wealth was intoxicating, but the reprieve for Zhongdu was temporary. In 1215, Genghis Khan returned. This time there would be no negotiations. The city's defenses had weakened. Corruption and despair had sapped the will to resist, and the Mongols had learned even more about siege warfare. After a brutal assault, Zhongdu fell. What followed was one of the great atrocities of history. The Mongols sacked the city for a month. The palaces were looted of every treasure. The libraries, containing irreplaceable works of Chinese literature and history, were burned. The population was massacred almost to the last person. Survivors spoke of mountains of bones and of fires that burned for weeks. The fall of Zhongdu sent shockwaves through all of East Asia. One of the great capitals of the world had been obliterated. The Jin Empire, though it would continue to exist for another 2 decades, was mortally wounded. The Mongols had proved they could defeat and destroy even the mightiest of civilizations. But perhaps more importantly, the Mongols themselves had been transformed by the experience. They were no longer simply nomadic warriors raiding for plunder. They were becoming the masters of a vast empire that included settled agricultural lands and great cities. Genghis Khan had to adapt his governance. He could not simply ride away from northern China as he might from a steppe battlefield. The conquered territories needed to be administered, taxes collected, and order maintained. So he appointed governors, often Chinese officials who had surrendered or defected, to manage the cities and provinces. He established tax systems modeled on Chinese precedents. He even began to appreciate Chinese culture, though he never abandoned his Mongol identity or customs. The wealth flowing into the Mongol Empire from China was transformative. It funded larger armies, better equipment, and the construction of a proper capital city back in Mongolia. Karakorum, though modest by Chinese standards, became a real city with palaces, warehouses, workshops, and temples for various religions. Merchants from across Asia came to trade there. It was a symbol of how far the Mongols had come from their origins as scattered tribes of herders. But with wealth and success came new challenges. Genghis Khan's sons and generals were becoming powerful in their own right, ruling vast territories and commanding large armies. Keeping the empire unified would require more than just personal loyalty to the great Khan. It would require institutions, laws, and a shared sense of purpose. Fortunately, Genghis Khan understood this. The Yasa was enforced strictly throughout the empire. The Yam system ensured that the Khan's orders could reach the most distant provinces, and the shared experience of conquest, the bonds forged in battle, and the wealth divided among the warriors created a powerful sense of Mongol identity and unity. The campaigns in China also taught the Mongols humility of a sort. They learned that there were peoples in the world who matched or even exceeded them in certain ways. Chinese engineering, medicine, and administrative sophistication were superior to anything the Mongols had known. Persian and Arab scholarship and astronomy were revelations. Genghis Khan encouraged his people to learn from the conquered, to adopt useful technologies and ideas while maintaining their own culture and values. This cultural flexibility, this willingness to incorporate the best of every civilization they encountered, would become one of the Mongol Empire's great strengths. By 1216, Genghis Khan had been continuously at war for more than a decade. He was in his 50s now, still vigorous, but feeling his years. The Jin were defeated but not destroyed. The Western Xia remained vassals, but sometimes seemed unreliable. There were always more tribes at the edges of the empire that needed to be brought to heel, always more fortifications to besiege, always more enemies to defeat. It might have seemed that Genghis Khan's great work was nearly complete. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Central Asia, from Siberian forests to the Tibetan Plateau. It was already the largest continuous land empire the world had ever seen. But Genghis Khan was not satisfied. His appetite for conquest had only grown with success. And now, his attention was turning westward, toward lands he had heard of but never seen, toward the wealthy cities of the Silk Road in Central Asia, toward the great Islamic civilization that had flourished for centuries beyond the western deserts. He could not have known it yet, but his greatest campaign, the one that would define his legacy and shake the world to its foundations, was about to begin. And it would start with an insult, a caravan, and a foolish governor who made the fatal mistake of underestimating the wrath of Genghis Khan. In the year 1218, a caravan of merchants made its way westward from Mongolia toward the lands of Islam. There were perhaps 500 men in the caravan, Muslim traders mostly, along with their Mongol companions and guards. They carried a fortune in goods: Chinese silk, jade, silver, musk, and other treasures of the East. This was not just a commercial venture, it was a diplomatic mission. Genghis Khan had sent these merchants to establish trade relations with the Khwarazm Empire, the great Islamic state that controlled Central Asia. The Khwarazm Empire, ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, was one of the most powerful states in the world. It stretched from the shores of the Persian Gulf to the edges of India, from the borders of Iraq to the doorstep of China. Its cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Herat, were famous throughout the Islamic world for their wealth, their learning, and their beauty. These were centers of art and science where scholars studied mathematics and astronomy, where poets composed verses in elegant Persian, where architects built mosques with domes that seemed to touch heaven. The Khwarazmian Empire was at the height of its power and prosperity. Genghis Khan had no quarrel with the Khwarazmians. On the contrary, he saw them as potential trading partners and possibly even allies. The message he sent with the merchants was friendly, proposing trade and peace between their two empires. It was a genuine offer. Genghis Khan valued commerce and the wealth it brought. He had no desire to fight on two fronts, against the Jin in the east and the Khwarazmians in the west. If they could do business peacefully, so much the better. The caravan reached the city of Otrar on the northern frontier of the Khwarazmian Empire. Otrar was governed by a man named Inalchuk, a relative of the Shah's mother, and thus a powerful figure despite his position in a border town. When Inalchuk saw the wealth the caravan carried, greed overwhelmed judgment. He accused the merchants of being Mongol spies, a ridiculous charge given that they were mostly Muslims. Then he seized all their goods and executed the entire caravan. 500 men murdered, and their goods stolen for nothing more than one man's greed. When word reached Genghis Khan of what had happened, his rage was terrible, but he controlled it. He was a man who had learned patience, who understood the value of giving an enemy a chance to make things right. He sent 3 ambassadors to Shah Muhammad, 1 Muslim and 2 Mongols. The message they carried was clear. The governor of Otrar had committed an outrage. Hand him over for punishment. Compensate for the stolen goods and there will be peace. Refuse and there will be war. Shah Muhammad made the worst decision of his life. Perhaps he was influenced by his mother, who hated Inalchuk's accusers. Perhaps he underestimated the Mongols, seeing them as just another group of barbarians from the steppe. Perhaps he was simply arrogant, confident in his empire's strength. Whatever the reason, he not only refused to hand over Inalchuk, he compounded the insult. He had the Muslim ambassador killed and sent the 2 Mongol ambassadors back with their beards burned off, a grave humiliation in both Mongol and Islamic culture. This was the moment when the fate of the Khwarazmian Empire was sealed. Genghis Khan called a Kurultai, a great gathering of his generals and chiefs. He explained what had happened and asked for their counsel. To a man, they agreed. This insult could not be tolerated. The deaths of the merchants and the ambassador had to be avenged. And beyond revenge, there was opportunity. The wealth of Central Asia was legendary. Now they had a justification to take it. In 1219, Genghis Khan assembled an army unlike any the world had seen. The exact numbers are disputed by historians, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to 200,000 warriors. What is certain is that it was the largest and most experienced force the Mongols had ever fielded. Veterans of the Chinese campaigns rode alongside steppe warriors. Chinese siege engineers accompanied the columns, bringing their expertise and equipment. The army brought its own herds, driving thousands of horses and livestock to provide food and remounts. This was not a raid, it was a campaign of total conquest. Genghis Khan divided his forces for maximum effect. He would lead the main army toward Bukhara and Samarkand, the heart of the empire. His sons Jochi and Chagatai would take Otrar, the city where the murders had occurred. His youngest son Tolui would sweep through Khorasan, the eastern provinces, and his two greatest generals Jebei and Subotai would pursue Shah Muhammad wherever he fled. The strategy was to strike everywhere at once, to overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond, to create chaos and terror that would paralyze resistance. The Shah's army was enormous, perhaps 400,000 men, twice the size of the Mongol force, but it was scattered across the vast empire, garrisoning cities and forts. Shah Muhammad made a fatal strategic error. Instead of concentrating his forces and meeting the Mongols in open battle, where numbers might have mattered, he tried to defend everything and ended up defending nothing effectively. He distributed his army among the various cities, leaving each garrison strong enough to feel confident, but not strong enough to withstand a determined Mongol assault. The siege of Otrar lasted 5 months. It was personal for the Mongols. This was the city where their merchants had been murdered, where the insult that had sparked this war had occurred. Jochi and Chagatai surrounded the city completely and set their engineers to work. The walls were pounded by catapults. Siege towers were built and brought up to the walls. The garrison fought desperately, but they were doomed. When the city finally fell, Inalchuck, the governor who had started it all, was captured alive. His punishment was fitting for a man whose greed had destroyed an empire. Molten silver, representing the wealth he had stolen, was poured into his eyes and ears. His death was slow and agonizing. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan approached Bukhara, one of the great cities of the Islamic world. The garrison, seeing the massive Mongol army approaching, panicked. The military commanders tried to break out and escape, abandoning the civilians. Most of them were cut down by Mongol cavalry as they fled. The city elders, seeing no hope of successful resistance, opened the gates and surrendered. What happened next has become one of the most famous moments in Genghis Khan's life. He rode into the city and went to the great mosque, the center of Islamic learning and worship. The citizens gathered, terrified, expecting massacre. Genghis Khan dismounted and entered the mosque. Whether he knew it was a mosque or simply thought it was the palace is debated. He mounted the pulpit where the imam would normally give sermons and addressed the crowd. According to the accounts, he said something like this: "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The exact words vary in different sources, but the message was clear. He saw himself as an instrument of divine justice, sent to punish the Shah and his people for their crimes and sins. It was a chilling pronouncement from a man who held absolute power over their lives. Genghis Khan ordered the city evacuated. The people were driven out into the surrounding fields. Then his soldiers systematically looted Bukhara of everything of value. The wealth accumulated over centuries was carried off, and then they set fires. The great libraries, containing irreplaceable manuscripts, burned. The palaces burned. The wooden structures throughout the city burned. Bukhara, one of the jewels of Central Asia, was left a smoking ruin. Next came Samarkand, perhaps the greatest city in Central Asia, a place of legendary beauty and wealth. The city was protected by walls and defended by a garrison of over 60,000 soldiers, more than most European kingdoms could field. But the Mongols had learned well from their Chinese campaigns. They brought up captives from previously conquered cities and drove them ahead of the assault forces. The defenders faced a horrible choice: shoot at the human shields, killing their own countrymen, or let the Mongols approach the walls unmolested. The siege lasted only 5 days. The garrison saw the fate of Bukhara and understood that resistance was futile. They surrendered. The city was spared the worst of the destruction, but it paid a terrible price. 30,000 of the garrison troops were executed. Craftsmen and skilled workers were gathered up and sent to Mongolia. The city was stripped of a large portion of its wealth, but it survived, and in time it would recover. The Mongols were learning that sometimes it was more profitable to leave a wealthy city functioning so it could be taxed rather than destroying it completely. Shah Muhammad, meanwhile, was running for his life. He had watched his empire crumble with stunning speed. City after city fell. His armies were defeated or surrendered without fighting. The 2 great cities of his realm were taken or destroyed, and now Jebi and Subutai, the 2 most brilliant and ruthless generals in the Mongol army, were pursuing him with 20,000 cavalry. The chase was epic. Muhammad fled west, racing ahead of his pursuers, never stopping long enough for them to catch him. He crossed Persia, heading for the shores of the Caspian Sea. Jebe and Subutai followed, destroying any force that tried to stop them, spreading terror and devastation across Persia. Muhammad reached a small island in the Caspian and thought he was finally safe. But he was a broken man, his empire destroyed, his reputation shattered. Within a few months, sick and despairing, he died. Some say it was disease. Others say it was simply the crushing weight of his failure that killed him. But the Mongol pursuit did not end with Muhammad's death. His son, Jalal ad-Din, took up the fight. He was a brave and capable warrior, and he managed to gather the remnants of the Khwarazmian forces. For a time, he had success, defeating some smaller Mongol detachments, but Genghis Khan personally led an army against him. They met in battle on the banks of the Indus River, at the very edge of the Indian subcontinent. It was a desperate fight. Jalal ad-Din's forces fought with the courage of men who had nothing left to lose. But they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. When the battle turned against them, Jalal ad-Din made a legendary escape. He spurred his horse over a cliff into the Indus River, plunging down into the water far below. Somehow, he survived the fall, and swam to the far shore. Genghis Khan, watching from above, is said to have remarked to his sons that this was a man worthy of respect, and a father should hope for such a son. Jalal ad-Din escaped that day, but he was a man without a kingdom. The Khwarazm Empire was finished. While Genghis Khan was dealing with Jalal ad-Din, Jebbe and Subutai continued their remarkable campaign. Having chased the Shah across Persia, they did not stop. They kept going west, raiding through Azerbaijan and Georgia. The Christian kingdoms of the Caucasus tried to stop them and were crushed. The Mongols crossed the Caucasus Mountains, something few armies had ever done, and emerged into the steppes north of the Black Sea. Here they encountered the Cumans, another Turkic nomadic people. The Cumans fled north, seeking help from the Russian princes. A coalition of Russian armies, perhaps 80,000 men, marched south to meet the Mongol threat. They vastly outnumbered Jebbe and Subutai's forces, but numbers meant little against Mongol tactics and generalship. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the Mongols used their classic strategy, feigned retreats to draw the enemy out, then sudden counterattacks to encircle and destroy isolated units. The Russian coalition was annihilated. 6 princes were killed. It was a catastrophic defeat, and it was Europe's first real encounter with the Mongol war machine. The survivors returned to their cities with tales of an unstoppable army of demons from the east. Having achieved this remarkable feat, Jebbe and Subutai turned back east, rejoining Genghis Khan in Central Asia. They had ridden completely around the Caspian Sea, covering thousands of miles, fighting battles and sieges along the way, and returned with minimal losses. It was one of the greatest cavalry exploits in military history, and it demonstrated the incredible capabilities of the Mongol army. By 1223, the Khwarazm Empire had ceased to exist. Its cities were destroyed or subjugated. Its armies were defeated. Its Shah was dead, and his son was a fugitive. Central Asia, one of the wealthiest regions in the world, was now part of the Mongol Empire. The conquest had taken less than 5 years, an astonishingly short time to destroy so great a power. The devastation was immense. Cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to ruins. Irrigation systems that had taken generations to build were destroyed, turning fertile farmland into desert. The death toll was in the millions. Some cities, like Merv, suffered near total extermination of their populations. Modern historians debate whether the Mongol invasion set back Central Asian civilization permanently, whether the region ever fully recovered from those terrible years. But from the Mongol perspective, the campaign was a spectacular success. Vast wealth flowed into the empire. New territories were added. The reputation of Mongol invincibility was established. No kingdom, no matter how powerful or how distant, was safe from Genghis Khan's reach. The lesson was clear. Cross the Mongols at your peril. Murder their merchants and ambassadors, and your entire civilization might be swept away. Genghis Khan was now in his 60s. He had conquered more territory and defeated more enemies than any military leader in history. His empire stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, from Siberia to India. He had transformed his people from scattered nomadic tribes into the masters of much of the known world, and yet, even now, he was not done. There were still scores to settle, still lands unconquered, still enemies unpunished. His final campaign would take him back to where it had all started, back to the deserts and mountains near Mongolia, back to settle accounts with the Western Shia, the Tengids who had been among his first conquests but who had grown rebellious and disloyal. Age and destiny were catching up with the great Khan. But before the end, there would be one more war, one more terrible demonstration of what it meant to defy Genghis Khan. By 1225, Genghis Khan had been at war almost continuously for 2 decades. The toll was visible on him. He was now in his 60s, ancient by the standards of the steppe where few men lived past 50. His hair and beard had gone grey. His body bore the scars of countless battles, old wounds that ached in cold weather. He had broken bones that had healed imperfectly. His teeth, never good, were failing. He suffered from what we might now call arthritis, his joints stiff and painful, especially in winter. But his mind remained sharp, his will unbroken, and his authority absolute. He was the great Khan, the universal ruler, master of the largest empire the world had ever seen. When he spoke, armies moved. When he commanded, cities fell. Yet for all his power, for all his conquests, there were problems he could not simply order solved. And chief among these were the tensions within his own family. Genghis Khan had 4 legitimate sons from his principal wife, Borte. Jochi, the eldest, whose paternity had always been quietly questioned. Chagatai, the second son, a fierce warrior and strict enforcer of the Yasa, but prone to cruelty and rigidity. Ogedei, the third son, intelligent and affable, a man who enjoyed wine perhaps too much, but who had proven himself a capable administrator and general. And Tolui, the youngest, perhaps the most talented military commander of them all, loyal and dependable. The succession was a constant source of tension. According to Mongol tradition, the youngest son should inherit the family's homeland and herds. This made sense for nomadic herders. The older sons would move away to establish their own households, while the youngest stayed to care for the aging parents and eventually inherit the central pastures. But an empire was not a herd of horses. It needed a single strong leader to hold it together. And it needed that leader to be someone all the others would accept. Yoshi and Chagatai hated each other with a passion that threatened to tear the empire apart. Chagatai never let anyone forget the circumstances of Jochi's birth, calling him the Merkid bastard, the son of a rapist rather than the son of Genghis Khan. Yochi, for his part, resented Chagatai's cruelty and his constant attacks on his legitimacy. At one Kurultai, their argument became so heated that they nearly came to blows in front of the assembled chiefs and generals. Only their father's intervention prevented violence. Genghis Khan recognized the danger. If these two were left to fight over the succession after his death, the empire would tear itself apart in civil war. He made a decision that showed both his wisdom and his pragmatism. He would not name Yochi as his successor, even though he was the eldest. The doubts about his paternity, fair or not, would make his rule too contested. He would not name Chagatai, who was too harsh and too rigid to command the loyalty of the diverse peoples of the empire. Instead, he would name Ogedei. Ogedei was not the most brilliant general, that was Tolui. He was not the fiercest warrior that was Chagatai, but he had qualities that were perhaps more important for holding an empire together. He was moderate and reasonable. He could listen to advice. He was generous and forgiving where his brothers were harsh and uncompromising. The Chinese bureaucrats liked him. The Mongol generals respected him. And crucially, both Yochi and Chagatai were willing to accept him, even if neither was willing to accept the other. But naming Ogedei as successor did not resolve all the family tensions. The empire would be divided among all the sons after Genghis Khan's death, each ruling a portion as semi-autonomous khans under the great Khan's overall authority. Jochi would get the western territories, the steppes north of the Caspian and Black Seas. Chagatai would receive Central Asia, the lands of the old Khwarazm Empire. Ogedei would get the central territories and the position of Great Khan, and Tolui would inherit Mongolia itself, the homeland, according to tradition. There was also the matter of grandsons. Genghis Khan's sons already had children of their own, and these grandsons had ambitions too. Batu, Jochi's son, would one day lead the Mongol conquest of Eastern Europe. Hulagu, Tolui's son, would destroy the Abbasid Caliphate and conquer the Middle East. Kublai, another of Tolui's sons, would complete the conquest of China and establish the Yuan dynasty. These future conflicts and triumphs were still ahead, but already the seeds were planted. In 1225, another problem demanded Genghis Khan's attention. The Western Xia, the Tangut Empire that had been one of his first conquests back in 1209, had grown rebellious. They had been required to provide troops for the Mongol campaigns against the Khwarazmians, but they had failed to send the promised forces. When Genghis Khan demanded an explanation, the Tangut ruler sent back a message of stunning arrogance. "If you do not have enough troops," he said, "then you do not deserve to be a ruler." It was an insult that could not be ignored. But it was more than that. If one vassal state could defy the great Khan with impunity, others would soon follow. The entire system of Mongol dominance, built on the certainty that rebellion meant destruction, would collapse. Genghis Khan had to respond, even though he was old and tired and suffering from his various ailments. In 1226, he launched what would be his final campaign. The army that rode south toward the Tangut lands was not as large as some of the previous expeditions, perhaps 60,000 men. But it was superbly trained and utterly ruthless. Genghis Khan was no longer interested in simply defeating the Western Xia. He intended to erase them from history, to make them an object lesson that would terrify potential rebels for generations to come. The campaign was difficult. The Tangut forces had learned from previous defeats and had fortified their positions well. The terrain was harsh, alternating between deserts and mountains, and Genghis Khan himself was failing. At some point during the campaign, he suffered an injury. The sources disagree on what exactly happened. Some say he fell from his horse during a hunt. Others say he was thrown when his horse was startled. Some accounts suggest he was wounded in battle, though this seems less likely given his age and the fact that he was no longer fighting on the front lines. Whatever the cause, the injury was serious. He was in pain constantly now. His generals urged him to return to Mongolia to rest and recover, but Genghis Khan refused. He had begun this war to punish the Tanguts for their defiance, and he would see it through to the end. He commanded from his bed when he could not mount a horse. He dictated orders and strategy to his generals, and when cities fell, he ordered massacres on a scale that shocked even his own warriors. The Tanguts fought with desperation, knowing what fate awaited them if they lost, but they were fighting an enemy that had conquered half the world. City after city fell. The Tangut armies were destroyed in battle after battle. By the summer of 1297, the Tangut capital was under siege, and it was clear the end was near. Genghis Khan knew he was dying. The injury, whether it was a fall or a wound, had never healed properly. Perhaps it had become infected. Perhaps it had caused internal bleeding that would not stop. He was feverish, weak, barely conscious at times, but he held on, driven by sheer will, determined to see the Tangut Emperor submit before he died. The Tangut Emperor finally surrendered, coming personally to Genghis Khan's camp to beg for mercy. There would be none. Genghis Khan, from his deathbed, ordered the emperor executed. Then he gave his final commands. The Tangut people were to be destroyed. Every man who could bear arms was to be killed. The cities were to be razed. Even the irrigation systems that sustained agriculture in that arid land were to be demolished. It was genocide, the systematic extermination of an entire people and their civilization. In August of 1227, in a camp along the Yellow River, Genghis Khan died. The exact date is uncertain. Sometime in late August. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious. The official Mongol histories say he died from his injuries and from fever. Persian sources suggest he was killed by a Tangut princess who had been brought to him as a concubine, and who somehow managed to wound him mortally. Chinese sources propose various other explanations. The truth is lost to history. What is certain is that his death was kept secret. The Mongol army was deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile populations. If word got out that the great Khan was dead, there could be rebellions, the army might be attacked, and the carefully planned succession might be thrown into chaos. So a small group of his closest companions wrapped his body and continued the campaign as though nothing had happened. Orders were still issued in his name. The siege continued, and when the Tangut capital finally fell, the massacre was carried out as Genghis Khan had commanded. Only after the army had begun its march back to Mongolia was the news of his death revealed. Even then, the secret was kept as much as possible. Anyone who encountered the funeral procession, anyone who saw the wagon carrying the great Khan's body, was killed on the spot. This was partly to maintain secrecy, but it was also rooted in Mongol beliefs about the afterlife. The great Khan would need servants in the next world, and these unfortunate souls would serve him there. The funeral itself was held in secret at a place called Birkenkulten, the sacred mountain where Genghis Khan had hidden as a young man fleeing from his enemies. It was fitting that he should be buried there, returning to the place that had sheltered him in his darkest hour. The exact location of the grave was concealed. Trees were planted over it. A river might have been diverted to flow over the burial site. The soldiers who dug the grave and knew its location were executed to ensure the secret would die with them. To this day, despite numerous expeditions and searches using modern technology, Genghis Khan's grave has never been found. It remains one of history's great mysteries. Some say that sacred Buddhist monks know the location but will never reveal it. Others claim that supernatural forces protect it from discovery. Most likely, the secret was simply kept too well, the knowledge lost when the last person who knew the location died. With Genghis Khan's death, an era ended. He had transformed the Mongols from scattered nomadic tribes into the rulers of the greatest land empire in history. He had conquered kingdoms and toppled civilizations. He had caused the deaths of millions, either directly through warfare and massacre or indirectly through the destruction of irrigation systems and farmland that led to famine. By some estimates, the population of Persia and Central Asia declined by up to 75% during the Mongol conquest. China suffered similar losses. It was devastation on a scale rarely seen in human history. Yet he had also created a new order. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, would facilitate trade and communication across Asia in ways that had never been possible before. Ideas, technologies, and goods would flow between East and West. The Silk Road would reach its greatest period of prosperity under Mongol protection. Genghis Khan's laws, the Yasa, would provide a framework of order and governance that transcended tribal and ethnic boundaries. His system of religious tolerance would allow Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and adherents of other faiths to coexist peacefully within the empire. He was, in every sense, one of history's most consequential figures. Not necessarily its greatest or most admirable, but certainly one whose impacts shaped the course of civilizations. The world he left behind was fundamentally different from the one he had been born into, and his legacy, for good and ill, would echo down through the centuries, influencing events and peoples far beyond the steppes where he began his remarkable journey from an orphaned outcast to the ruler of the world. The death of Genghis Khan did not mean the end of Mongol expansion. Far from it. In some ways, the greatest conquests were still to come. His sons and grandsons would continue the work he had begun, carrying the Mongol banner to lands he had never seen, creating an empire even larger than the one he left behind. But they would do so following the systems he had established, using the tactics he had perfected, and driven by the momentum he had created. Ogedai became the Great Khan in 1229, 2 years after his father's death. The delay was deliberate. Time was needed to secure the succession, to ensure all the major commanders and princes would accept the new ruler, and to complete the mourning period required by Mongol custom. When Ogedai finally took power, he proved to be an excellent choice. He lacked his father's genius for warfare, but he was an able administrator and a skilled diplomat. He understood that an empire as vast as the one he inherited could not be ruled by constant conquest alone. It needed infrastructure, organization, and a functioning economy. Under Ogedai's rule, the Mongol Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. To the east, the war against the Jin Dynasty was finally concluded. In 1234, the Jin capital of Kaifeng fell after a desperate siege. The Jin emperor committed suicide, and the dynasty that had ruled northern China for over a century was no more. The Mongols now controlled all of northern China and were eyeing the southern Song dynasty, which still ruled the land south of the Yangtze River. But the most dramatic expansion came in the west. In 1236, Ogedai authorized a massive campaign into Europe. The army was commanded by Batu, the son of Joshi, along with Subutai, the brilliant general who had served Genghis Khan and who was now an old man, but still sharp as ever. The Mongol force, perhaps 150,000 strong, swept across the Russian principalities like a winter storm. The Russian lands fell with shocking speed. City after city was besieged and taken. Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, a minor town at the time, all burned. The Russian princes tried to mount resistance, but their armies were destroyed piecemeal. At the Battle of the Sit River in 1238, the last major Russian force was annihilated. Grand Prince Yuri of Vladimir died fighting, and Russian resistance collapsed. The Rus principalities became vassals of the Mongol Empire, required to pay tribute and provide troops when demanded. This vassalage would last for over 2 centuries, profoundly shaping Russian history and culture. But the Mongols did not stop at Russia's borders. They pushed into Eastern Europe. Poland was invaded in 1241. At the Battle of Legnica, a combined force of Poles, Germans, and Knights Templar was crushed. The head of the defeated commander was displayed on a spear as the Mongols continued their advance. Hungary was invaded simultaneously. At the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian army, one of the most powerful in Europe, was destroyed in a single afternoon. King Bela barely escaped with his life. The road to Vienna, to Italy, to the heart of Western Europe lay open. Europe was in panic. Refugees fleeing before the Mongol advance brought tales of terror. Chronicles described the invaders as demons, as agents of the apocalypse, as punishment sent by God for the sins of Christendom. Pope Gregory IV called for a crusade, but the Christian kingdoms were too frightened and disorganized to mount effective resistance. It seemed entirely possible that the Mongols would conquer all of Europe as they had conquered Russia, China, and Central Asia. But then, in late 1241, news reached the Mongol army that Ogedai had died. According to Mongol law and custom, all princes and major commanders had to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would elect the next great Khan. Batu and the other commanders withdrew from Hungary and Poland, pulling back to Russia. They would never return. The Mongol invasion of Western Europe ended not because they were defeated, but because of an accident of timing and tradition. Europe had been saved, but it was a very near thing. The succession after Ogedai's death was contested and messy, taking several years to resolve. Eventually, his son Guyuk became Great Khan, but he died after only 2 years. Then came Mongke, a grandson of Genghis Khan through Tolui. Mongke was a capable ruler who reorganized the empire and launched new campaigns of conquest. Under his direction, his brother Hulagu led an army into the Middle East. The campaign in the Middle East would be one of the most consequential in history. Hulagu's army destroyed the assassins, the feared cult of killers who had terrorized the region for decades. Then, in 1258, they turned toward Baghdad, the city that had been the capital of the Islamic world for 5 centuries, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the greatest cities on earth. The siege of Baghdad was brutal. The Caliph al-Mustasim, secure behind his massive walls and trusting in the sanctity of his position, refused to surrender. It was a fatal mistake. When the city fell, the Mongols showed no mercy. The libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom with its countless irreplaceable manuscripts, were destroyed. Books were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water reportedly ran black with ink. The population was massacred. Estimates of the death toll range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. The caliph himself was executed, reportedly by being wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses, so that his blood would not be spilled on the ground, a mark of dark respect for his position. The destruction of Baghdad sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had existed for over 500 years, was ended. The political and cultural center of Islam was obliterated. Hulagu pushed on, conquering Syria and threatening Egypt, but at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the Mongols finally met defeat. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, led by the brilliant General Baibars, defeated the Mongol army. It was the first time the Mongols had been decisively beaten in pitched battle. The Mongol expansion in the Middle East ended there, just short of taking the last great Islamic power. Meanwhile, in the East, the conquest of China continued. Mongke died in 1259 while campaigning in southern China. His death triggered another succession crisis, this time between his brothers Kublai and Arik Boki. Kublai won the civil war and became Great Khan, though his authority was increasingly limited to the eastern part of the empire. The Mongol Empire was beginning to fragment into semi-independent khanats. Kublai focused on completing the conquest of China. It took another 2 decades, but in 1279 the southern Song dynasty finally fell. For the first time in history, all of China was ruled by foreigners. Kublai established the Yuan dynasty and made himself Emperor of China. He moved the capital to Kanbalik, which we know as Beijing, and surrounded himself with Chinese advisors and rituals. He was still a Mongol, still a grandson of Genghis Khan, but he was also becoming Chinese in many ways. Under the Yuan dynasty, China experienced both destruction and innovation. Mongol rule was often harsh, with the Chinese population divided into categories based on ethnicity, with ethnic Mongols at the top and Han Chinese at the bottom. But it was also a time of cultural exchange. European travelers like Marco Polo visited China and brought back tales of its wonders. Chinese inventions like gunpowder and printing spread westward more rapidly. The Grand Canal was extended. Paper money was issued throughout the empire, creating one of the first large-scale fiat currencies in history. At its height, around 1279, the Mongol Empire encompassed roughly 24 million square kilometers, about 16% of the Earth's land surface. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, from Siberia to the Indian Ocean. It included territories in modern-day China, Mongolia, Russia, Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Eastern Europe, Korea, and parts of Southeast Asia. No empire before or since has controlled so much contiguous territory. This vast empire, despite its origins in conquest and terror, brought a period of relative peace and prosperity known as the Pax Mongolica. For perhaps a century, from roughly 1250 to 1350, the Silk Road functioned with unprecedented efficiency and safety. A merchant could travel from Italy to China with reasonable expectation of arriving alive with his goods intact. Ideas and technologies spread across this vast space. Chinese inventions reached Europe. Islamic science influenced China. It was an early form of globalization, made possible by Mongol military power and administrative skill. But the empire was always fragile, held together more by the memory of Genghis Khan and the respect for his descendants than by any real political unity. By the mid-1300s, it had effectively split into 4 separate khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Golden Horde in Russia and Eastern Europe. These khanates sometimes cooperated and sometimes fought each other. The dream of a single unified Mongol empire was fading. The collapse, when it came, was relatively swift. In China, the Yuan dynasty grew weak and corrupt. Natural disasters, including floods and famines, were seen as signs that the dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. Rebellions broke out. In 1368, Chinese rebels drove the Mongols out of China entirely, establishing the Ming dynasty. The descendants of Kublai Khan retreated to Mongolia, reduced once again to the status of nomadic herders on the steppe. The other khanates lasted longer, but also eventually fell. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed in the 1330s, torn apart by succession disputes and economic problems. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented into smaller states. Only the Golden Horde in Russia maintained some cohesion, but even it was weakening. By 1500, the Mongol Empire as a meaningful political entity had ceased to exist, yet the legacy remained. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan was and is revered as the father of the nation, the greatest hero in their history. After centuries of being downplayed or ignored during the communist era, his memory has been rehabilitatively embraced in modern Mongolia. His face appears on currency. Statues of him are everywhere. The main airport in the capital is named after him. He is a symbol of Mongol pride and identity. In the lands the Mongols conquered, the memory is more complicated. In Russia, the period of Mongol rule, known as the Tatar yoke, is remembered as a dark time, centuries of subjugation and tribute. Yet Mongol administrative practices influenced the development of the Russian state, and some scholars argue that Russian autocracy has its roots in Mongol methods of rule. In China, the Yuan dynasty is acknowledged as a legitimate dynasty, but the Mongols are remembered as foreign conquerors who ruled harshly and were eventually expelled. Yet the territorial extent of modern China owes much to Mongol conquests, including the incorporation of Tibet and parts of Central Asia. In the Middle East and Central Asia, the Mongol invasions are remembered as catastrophic. The destruction of Baghdad, the massacre of millions, and the devastation of agriculture and irrigation systems are seen as disasters from which these regions took centuries to recover. Some historians argue that the Islamic world never fully recovered its previous cultural and scientific preeminence after the Mongol invasions. In Europe, which was barely touched by the Mongols compared to other regions, they exist more in legend than in history. Medieval chronicles portrayed them as apocalyptic horrors, but they also inadvertently helped Europe by weakening both the Islamic powers and the Byzantine Empire, creating opportunities for European expansion. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Genghis Khan is genetic. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a study showing that approximately 16 million men alive today, about 0.5% of the male population of the world, carry a Y chromosome lineage that originated in Mongolia about 1,000 years ago. The researchers concluded that this lineage most likely originated with Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. Through his sons, grandsons, and the traditional practice of Mongol nobles taking multiple wives and concubines, Genghis Khan's genetic legacy spread across Asia. If the research is correct, 1 in every 200 men alive today is a direct male line descendant of Genghis Khan. It is, in a sense, his most enduring conquest. Let us step back now from the grand sweep of conquest and empire and look more closely at the people who made it all possible. What was it like to be a Mongol warrior in the army of Genghis Khan? How did these nomadic herders transform themselves into the most feared military force on earth? To understand the Mongol conquest, we must understand the Mongols themselves, their way of life, their skills, and their culture. A Mongol warrior's life began almost from birth. Children of the steppe, both boys and girls, learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. A 3-year-old might be tied onto a gentle horse and led around the camp. By 5 or 6, children rode independently, racing each other across the grasslands, learning balance and control instinctively. By the time a boy reached his teens, riding was as natural as walking, and the horse was not just a means of transportation, but an extension of his own body. The Mongol horse was the foundation of everything. These horses were small by the standards of European war horses or Arabian stallions, standing perhaps 12 to 14 hands high, with stocky builds and shaggy coats. They looked almost like ponies, but they were incredibly tough. They could survive on the sparse grass of the steppe, digging through snow with their hooves to find forage in winter. They could go days without water if necessary. They could carry heavy loads and run for hours without tiring. A Mongol warrior typically had 3 to 5 horses, sometimes more, allowing him to switch mounts during a campaign and always have fresh animals. The relationship between a Mongol and his horse was intimate. Mongols drank mare's milk, either fresh or fermented into kumis, the mildly alcoholic drink that was a staple of their diet. When necessary, on long campaigns where food was scarce, a warrior might make a small cut in his horse's neck, drink some blood for sustenance, then seal the wound. The horse would recover, and the warrior would have the protein and nutrients he needed to continue. This practice shocked and horrified outsiders, but for the Mongols it was simply practical. The horse gave milk like a cow, wool from its mane and tail, leather from its hide when it died, and transportation while it lived. It was the most useful animal imaginable. Training for warfare began early. Boys learned archery from the age of 4 or 5. The Mongol bow was a marvel of engineering, a composite bow made from layers of wood, a horn, and sinew, all glued together and wrapped in birch bark. When unstrung, it curved backward, a recurved design that stored enormous energy. When strung and drawn, it required tremendous strength to pull, perhaps 160 pounds of draw weight or more. But it could shoot an arrow over 300 yards, and in the hands of a skilled archer, it was deadly accurate at 100 yards or more. A Mongol warrior carried 2 bows and 2 quivers. One bow was heavier, for long-range shooting during the approach to battle or while skirmishing. The second was lighter, for quick shooting in close combat. One quiver held arrows with light heads designed for distance. The other held arrows with heavier, armor-piercing heads for close-range work. A warrior might carry 60 or more arrows into battle. They practiced constantly, shooting at targets while riding, shooting forward and backward, shooting while the horse was at full gallop. By adulthood, a Mongol warrior could hit targets while riding at speed that European archers could barely hit while standing still. But archery was only part of their training. They learned to hunt from horseback, pursuing wolves, deer, and other game across the steppe. These hunts were not just for food, but for training. Genghis Khan organized massive battue hunts involving thousands of warriors. They would form a huge circle, perhaps 100 miles in circumference, and gradually close in, driving all the game toward the center. The hunts could last for weeks and required the same coordination, discipline, and tactics used in warfare. A warrior who got out of position and let an animal escape through his section of the line would be punished. These hunts taught young warriors to maintain formation, to follow orders, and to work as part of a coordinated whole. They also learned to wrestle, one of the 3 traditional Mongol sports along with archery and horse racing. Mongol wrestling taught balance, strength, and the importance of using an opponent's momentum against him. The same principles applied in mounted combat, where a warrior needed to stay on his horse while trying to unseat his enemy. The Mongol warrior's equipment was carefully designed for mobility and effectiveness. He wore a lamellar armor made of small iron or hardened leather plates laced together with leather thongs. It was lighter than the plate armor worn by European knights, but still provided good protection. Under the lamellar armor, he wore a silk shirt. This was not for comfort, but for protection. When an arrow penetrated the armor, the silk would wrap around the arrowhead. This made it much easier to extract the arrow from a wound without causing additional damage by pulling the barbed head back through tissue. On his head, he wore a helmet, usually of iron, with a pointed top to deflect blows. Some helmets had ear and neck guards around his neck. He might wear a leather or mail collar for additional protection. He carried a round shield. But unlike European knights who relied heavily on shields, Mongols preferred to use their mobility and archery to avoid being hit rather than blocking blows. His weapons varied but typically included his composite bow and arrows, a curved saber for close combat, a lance, a lasso for pulling enemies from their horses, and sometimes an axe or mace. Everything was designed to be used from horseback. The Mongol warrior rarely fought on foot. To do so was to give up his greatest advantage, mobility. Life in the Mongol army on campaign was harsh but sustainable. The warriors could cover enormous distances, sometimes 60 or even 80 miles in a day when necessary, far more than any European or Chinese army could manage. They did this by rotating between their multiple horses, never riding one animal to exhaustion. They carried minimal supplies, living off the land when possible, eating whatever they could hunt or forage. They would eat almost anything, marmots, roots, even their horses if absolutely necessary. They could go days with little food or sleep when required. The social organization of the army was based on the decimal system Genghis Khan had established. A warrior belonged to an arban of 10 men. These 10 would camp together, fight together, and share in the plunder together. If one man fled from battle, all 10 might be executed. This created tremendous peer pressure and unit cohesion. The 10 men in an arban usually came from different clans and tribes, deliberately mixed to prevent old tribal loyalties from undermining discipline. 10 arban made a zun of 100 men, commanded by a zun commander. 10 zun made a mingan of 1,000, and 10 mingan made a tumen of 10,000, the largest standard unit. Commanders at each level were chosen for competence and loyalty. They led from the front, sharing the dangers with their men. But they were also absolutely in command. Orders were to be followed instantly and exactly. The discipline of the Mongol army was legendary and shocking to outsiders, who expected barbarians to be disorganized. In battle, the Mongol tactics were sophisticated and deadly. They would typically open with long-range archery, riding parallel to the enemy line and shooting volley after volley of arrows. If the enemy charged, the Mongols would retreat, shooting backward over their horses' rumps as they fled. This Parthian shot, named after the ancient Parthian warriors who had used it against Rome, was incredibly difficult to master, but devastatingly effective. The pursuing enemy would find themselves riding into a constant hail of arrows. If the enemy held their ground, the Mongols would feign retreat, drawing portions of the enemy force out of formation, and then suddenly counterattacking with fresh units held in reserve. They would use smoke and dust to conceal their movements. They would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, appearing to be everywhere at once. They used psychological warfare, spreading terror through their reputation and through the example of what happened to cities that resisted. But for all their fearsome reputation in battle, Mongol warriors were not mindless killing machines. Back in camp, they were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. They loved their families, told stories around the fire, played games, and made music. The morenkur, the horsehead fiddle, would play in the evenings, its haunting melodies speaking of the vastness of the steppe and the loneliness of the nomadic life. They practiced shamanism, believing in spirits that inhabited the natural world, in the sky god Tengri, and in the importance of maintaining harmony with nature. A shaman might accompany the army, performing rituals before battle, interpreting omens, and healing the sick. They respected the power of words and oaths. An oath taken seriously was considered absolutely binding. To break an oath was to lose all honor and face. Women in Mongol society had more freedom and status than in most contemporary cultures. They could own property, divorce their husbands, participate in councils, and sometimes even lead armies. Mongol women managed the camps while the men were away at war, making crucial decisions about when to move, where to find grazing, and how to allocate resources. Some women became warriors themselves, though this was less common. The Mongol diet was based on meat and dairy. They ate mutton, goat, horse, and whatever game they could hunt. They drank mare's milk, ate yogurt and cheese, and made a kind of dried meat jerky that could last for months. They had little agriculture, relying on trade or conquest to obtain grain, fruits, and vegetables. This meat-heavy diet gave them endurance and strength, but also made them dependent on their herds and on continued expansion to new grazing lands. The jurta, or ger, was their home, a circular felt tent supported by a wooden frame. It could be assembled or disassembled in about an hour. Inside, it was surprisingly comfortable, with felt rugs on the floor, a central hearth for cooking and warmth, and sleeping areas around the perimeter. The door always faced south toward the sun and warmth. The place of honor, the koimor, was opposite the door at the north side, where guests would be seated and where family treasures and religious items were kept. Despite their reputation for destruction, the Mongols had a deep appreciation for loyalty, courage, and skill even in their enemies. A brave foe who fought honorably might be spared and even recruited into the Mongol army. A skilled craftsman, a wise counselor, or a talented administrator could rise high in Mongol service regardless of their ethnicity or original nationality. This pragmatism and meritocracy were unusual for their time and contributed significantly to Mongol success. This, then, was the Mongol warrior. Not a mindless barbarian, but a highly trained, disciplined, and skilled professional who had been preparing for warfare literally since childhood. Tough, adaptable, loyal to his unit and his Khan, and absolutely lethal in combat. When tens of thousands of such warriors moved together, coordinated by sophisticated strategy and driven by the will of a leader like Genghis Khan, they became an irresistible force that reshaped the world. And so we come to the end of our journey across the steppe and through the centuries, following the remarkable life of Temujin, who became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. We have watched an orphaned boy digging for roots to survive, transform himself into the conqueror of the world. We have witnessed the unification of fractious tribes into a nation, the destruction of ancient civilizations, and the creation of an empire that stretched from one end of the earth to the other. It has been a tale of ambition, cruelty, genius, and will on a scale that may never be equaled. But as we sit here by our fire, the story told in the night growing late, we might ask ourselves what lessons, if any, can we draw from this extraordinary life? What can we, living in our own time with its own challenges and complexities, learn from a nomadic warrior who died nearly 800 years ago? First, there is the lesson of adaptability. Genghis Khan's greatest strength, perhaps even more important than his tactical brilliance or his personal courage, was his willingness to learn, to adapt, to incorporate new ideas and new methods regardless of where they came from. He began as a nomadic herder who knew nothing of siege warfare or urban governance. He ended as the master of hundreds of cities, employing Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, and European craftsmen. He saw what worked and he used it without sentimentality or prejudice. In our own rapidly changing world, this ability to adapt, to let go of old ways that no longer serve us and to embrace new approaches remains vitally important. There is also the lesson of merit over birth. The traditional steppe society valued noble blood above all else. The white Jurta people expected to rule simply because of who their ancestors were. Genghis Khan tore down that system and replaced it with something revolutionary, a meritocracy where ability, loyalty, and achievement mattered more than lineage. A slave could become a general, a shepherd could become a governor. All that mattered was competence and dedication. This idea that people should be judged by what they can do rather than who their parents were seems obvious to us now. But in Genghis Khan's time, it was radical, and it was one of the keys to Mongol success. Societies that reward talent, regardless of its source, tend to thrive. Those that waste talent because it comes from the wrong family or class tend to stagnate. Leadership itself is perhaps the most obvious lesson. Genghis Khan was one of history's great leaders, able to inspire fanatical loyalty in his followers. He did this through a combination of methods. He led by example, sharing the hardships of his warriors. He was generous in victory, sharing plunder fairly and rewarding those who served him well. He was ruthless with enemies but loyal to friends. He created a shared sense of purpose and identity among the Mongols, giving them something larger than themselves to belong to. And he was absolutely consistent and predictable in his behavior. His followers always knew where they stood with him. If you were loyal and competent, you would be rewarded. If you betrayed or failed him, you would be punished. This clarity and consistency created trust, even among men who had good reason to fear him. But we must also grapple with the darker lessons, the questions that have no easy answers. Genghis Khan achieved his empire through extraordinary violence. Millions died in his conquests. Entire civilizations were destroyed or set back centuries. Can we separate the administrative genius and tactical brilliance from the mountains of corpses? Can we admire the meritocracy and the religious tolerance while acknowledging the genocide and the massacre? The ethical question of terror as a tool of statecraft is particularly troubling. Genghis Khan used terror deliberately and systematically by utterly destroying cities that resisted and then ensuring that survivors spread the story. He made resistance seem futile. Many cities subsequently surrendered without a fight, saving lives in the short term. But this strategy required the willingness to massacre entire populations pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others. Is it acceptable to kill thousands to intimidate millions into submission? Most of us would say no, that such calculations are monstrous. But for Genghis Khan, operating in a time and place where warfare was already brutal and life was cheap, it was simply a pragmatic choice that achieved his objectives efficiently. There is also the question of historical judgment itself. How do we evaluate someone like Genghis Khan? By the standards of his own time, he was in many ways progressive. His religious tolerance, his meritocracy, his relatively humane treatment of craftsmen and skilled workers, and his legal code that applied equally to all were ahead of most contemporary rulers. By modern standards, however, he was a war criminal on an epic scale, responsible for deaths that may have numbered in the tens of millions. both perspectives are valid, and both are incomplete. History's great figures are seldom simple heroes or villains. They are complicated, contradictory, products of their times who nonetheless shape those times in remarkable ways. Perhaps one lesson we can draw is about the relationship between nomadic and settled civilizations. For most of human history, there has been a tension between these two ways of life. The nomads, mobile and martial, looked at the wealth of cities with covetous eyes. The settled peoples, numerous and productive, looked at the nomads as barbarians to be feared or despised. The Mongol conquest represented the nomads' greatest triumph, but it was also essentially their last. The Mongols conquered settled civilizations, but in doing so, they were changed by them. Within a few generations, the Mongol rulers of China, Persia, and Russia had adopted the cultures of their subjects. They became sedentary, urbanized, civilized. The pattern repeated throughout history. Nomadic conquerors would overwhelm settled empires, then gradually become absorbed by the very civilizations they had conquered. In the modern world, true nomadism has almost disappeared. The steppe is now divided by borders and fences. The days when a people could migrate freely with their herds following the grass and water are largely gone. What the Mongols represented, that pure nomadic culture at its most powerful and successful, no longer exists. Perhaps this is progress. Settled civilization has given us medicine, science, art, and literature in ways that nomadic life never could. But something has also been lost. A kind of freedom, a direct relationship with nature and with the vast spaces of the earth that we will never experience again. There is also something to be said about legacy and memory. Genghis Khan died nearly 800 years ago, but his name is still known around the world. He appears in movies, books, video games, and popular culture. Scholars still debate his impact on history. Geneticists study his descendants. In Mongolia, he is a national hero, the founding father of the nation. In other lands, he remains a symbol of destruction and terror, but he is remembered. How many of us can say that our names will be spoken centuries after we die? There is a kind of immortality in that, even if it is not the immortality we might choose. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. One person, even starting from the most unpromising circumstances, can change the world. Temujin had every reason to fail. He was born into a minor clan, orphaned young, abandoned by his people, enslaved, hunted, reduced to eating field mice to survive. By all rights, he should have died young and forgotten, just another casualty of the steppe's endless violence. But he refused to accept that fate. Through courage, intelligence, ruthlessness, and an absolute refusal to give up, he not only survived, but prevailed. He took his suffering and his rage and forged them into weapons. He turned his enemies into allies, his weaknesses into strengths, and his impossible dreams into reality. We need not admire everything he did. We need not excuse his cruelty or celebrate his conquests. But we can recognize the extraordinary force of will that drove him, the sheer determination that allowed him to reshape the world according to his vision. In our own lives, when we face obstacles that seem insurmountable, when circumstances seem to conspire against us, when the easy thing would be to give up, Perhaps we can remember the boy digging for roots on the cold steppe, who decided he would rather die fighting than live on his knees, and who became the master of the world. And on that thought, my dear friends, as the fire burns low and the night grows cold, let us end our story. We have traveled far together, from the birth of a child with blood in his fist to the death of the greatest conqueror history has known. We have crossed steppes and mountains, witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and explored a life that contained more drama and consequence than 100 ordinary lives. The world that Genghis Khan shaped for good and ill is still with us, still influencing our history and our present. His legacy endures, complex and troubling and undeniable. So pull your cloaks a little tighter against the night air, bank the fire so it will burn until morning, and rest well, knowing that you have heard the tale of Temujin, the child of the steppe who became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, whose name even now, all these centuries later, has the power to inspire awe and fear and wonder. Until next time, dear adventurers, stay safe and sweet dreams.